Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 1. Today we're looking at Chapter 16, which involves contractual remedies. The overall learning objectives for this chapter is to understand the basic theory of contract remedies. We'll look at the interests that are protected by contract remedies, as well as types of remedies, and then we'll look at equitable remedies and then the limitations on remedies. So everything remedies. That's going to be what this chapter is about. Anyway, when we talk about, breach, breach is a failure to act or perform in the manner called for by the contract. And so, it can be, like, okay, you have maybe you have a monthly payment obligation, and maybe it's on the first of every month. And so, maybe for the first 6 months, you make your payments on the first like normal. Month 7, the first comes and goes, and you don't make any kind of payment. At that point, technically, you're in breach. Because when you were expected to perform some aspect of the contract and you did not do that. Anticipatory repudiation is where a party makes it clear to the other party in a contract that they're not going to be able to honor the agreement as promised. So maybe let's use that example again. You make 6 payments on time, and then maybe a week before payment 7 is expected, you call the other party and say, look, I know I'm supposed to pay in 1 week, but I'm not going to be able to do that. At that point, that is what's referred to as anticipatory repudiation. And we'll talk about kind of like the range of options that you have at your disposal if and when that occurs. I have, it says, see the case of Friends. And again, I won't read all this to you, but, you can read it, if you want to look at the PowerPoint or if you download it. Popular, NBC sitcom, dating back, 20, almost 30 years now. Remarkable how time goes by so fast. But in this sitcom, after a few years of its run, the cast, everyone kind of discovered that this was a special show. It was wildly popular, financially very, very successful. And the cast decided that they wanted more money, per episode. And a bigger piece of the pie. And so what they did was, fortunately they, the 6 of them, the actors, they decided to kind of, approach it, as a unified front. And so even though they had time left on their existing contract, they basically told, NBC that unless you pay us more money per episode, we are not going to perform as promised. So, in the world of like anticipatory repudiation or breach, they haven't breached yet. They still are showing up to do work. But there is a looming threat out there in the near future that, if they don't get more pay per episode each, then they're going to strike. And so that would be anticipatory repudiation. So, if you're NBC, and I try and walk students through this when I have like face-to-face classes. I try and, write on a board. I'm like, well, what are our range of options here if you're NBC? On one end of the continuum, they could say, they could like someone desperate, like, please don't leave. It's like, I'll do anything. And so they could just cave and say, what do you guys want? And we'll pay you that. Probably not a good standard approach in, some sort of negotiation of a dispute, but that's one option. NBC could just say, sure, whatever you guys want, just don't leave. The other range, the other opposite end of the spectrum is that NBC could say, look, if you guys don't show up, then we're just going to, hire 3 new guys, 3 new girls, and they're going to take over your part, and it'll be like a soap opera. It'll be like the part of Ross is now played by so and so, and you guys, for the remainder of your contract, we will prevent you from doing any other work in entertainment, and that would be kind of like a very heavy-handed kind of approach. The other range in that continuum is something in the middle, and so that's where it's like, okay, let's meet, let's discuss, let's negotiate this. And that's, in fact, what NBC did. They kind of said, okay, fine, we'll pay you a little bit more per episode. The cast had to come down from what they were asking, but NBC went up from what they were paying the actors. And it's a unique situation because, if you know anything about the show, it was wildly popular. It made a ton of money. While it was in production and even in syndication, it's still making a ton of money. And so it's a very, very kind of like, like coming together of unique forces that pretty much, it benefited the cast, so they were able to get the increase in pay that they had expected. But it's a great example. I mean, you or I, in the employment setting, if we go to our boss and say, look, we need a, 25% raise, or we're leaving, I mean, you and I both know the reality of that situation. It's like we're not going to probably get very far with that. And we probably will leave that meeting without a job. But this was kind of like a unique kind of thing within the world of entertainment. But great example of, it wasn't necessarily a breach. It could have led to that, but it certainly was anticipatory repudiation in terms of like, unless you pay us more, we're not going to perform as per the contract. You can always do what's called a waiver of a breach. And so let's say that, so let's say someone owes you money and they make monthly payments, and let's say they start paying you late at a certain point. So instead of paying you on the 1st, they start paying you on the 15th, and you just keep accepting it. And at that point, you're kind of waiving, their kind of breach of the original obligation under the contract at that point. You can do what's called like under protest or with reservation of rights. And so if the other side performs, but they do it in a deficient way, then, you can always kind of let them know in writing that, it's like, okay, I acknowledge that you performed, but it was defective. Maybe you were late, or it wasn't the type of good that you were supposed to provide, whatever the situation is. But, make sure you use language that you say, I'm accepting your performance, but it's under protest, or I'm reserving my rights for at a future date should litigation be required. Remedies for breach. So, if someone actually breaches, you can waive it, you can launch into litigation mode, you can try and negotiate. That's really the big picture. If it's anticipatory repudiation, you kind of have two options. You can kind of wait and see, and maybe they'll decide to perform, even though they said they weren't going to. And then if they don't perform by the date they're supposed to, that's breach. Or once they announce that they're going to, engage in anticipatory repudiation, you can treat that moment like a breach as well. And so you can proceed immediately into an action for damages. You can maybe offer to cancel the contract. You can negotiate. You can do whatever at that point. So breach, you've got your affirmative options immediately available. With anticipatory repudiation, you can either do the same thing, or you could wait until that event where it does become an actual breach. That's up to you at that point. There may be strategic advantages for doing one versus the other. In terms of legal remedies, there's two general categories, legal and equitable. And so, when we talk about like compensatory damages, those are damages that are caused directly by the breach. So, whatever the costs that you have incurred because of the breach, that would be compensatory in nature. Nominal sometimes are where you don't have an actual loss, but I feel like I'm going to sneeze, excuse me. But you want to impose some kind of penalty, and maybe it's a nominal or some kind of small sum that's going to be imposed. Varying from state to state, excuse me, are what are called punitive damages. And so usually these are sometimes treble damages. So whatever your actual damages are, if punitive is permitted in your jurisdiction, that would be like maybe ×3. So maybe you incurred $10,000 in damages, and as a penalty, let's say you get punitive or treble damages, you could impose, or the court could impose, an additional $30,000, 3 times the original amount. So again, these are different types of legal remedies available. Equitable remedies, so specific performance, that's a fancy phrase for, just means a judicial order requiring somebody to do something. We don't force people to work against their will. We had a war that settled that, in the 1800s. So we don't do any kind of like forced labor anymore. But, let's say you're trying to buy real estate, and let's say the seller at the last minute wants to back out. Well, a judge can order the seller to show up at closing and sign off on all the documentation as per the contract. That would be like an order of specific performance at that point. You can have what's called injunctive relief. That's again another fancy phrase that just means it's a judicial order directing somebody to stop doing whatever it is that they are doing. And then you can also have what's called restitution. That's where you try and put the parties back into their original position before the contract was made. Sometimes that's possible. Maybe you put a deposit down, but then, something happened. It's like, well, just get your deposit back. And if you received any consideration, you return that to the other party to the agreement. So, again, the wonderful thing that I really love about contracts is that there is so many options to kind of fix problems, whether they're minor or if they're major in nature. You've got a lot of different options available. You do have, as the aggrieved party, so the party that's done nothing wrong, but you're suffering some kind of a loss, you do have what's called an obligation to mitigate damages. That means that you just can't rack up damages in order to hurt the other side. You've got to, kind of reduce your financial loss or liability to the extent you have control over that. So that's just a general kind of principle. Liquidated damages is a contractual provision that says if we have some kind of default or breach, this is what each side would have to pay, and it's kind of like walk away at that point. And so it's, as long as it's reasonable in nature, regardless of whatever your costs are or your damages, whatever you agree to, you have to be very careful with liquidated damages, because often if you do try and litigate or challenge it, as long as it's reasonable, a judge is going to enforce what was in the contract. So maybe, let's say I decide to buy your house and I put down a deposit, let's say of $10,000, and then I fail to perform. I can't go into closing for some reason. A lot of times in contracts for sale for property, you kind of forfeit your down payment if you are unable to complete the closing process. Now there's exceptions. Maybe you don't get financing. There's some variables that could justify you getting your deposit back. But let's say you're able to purchase it, but you just don't. Then liquidated damages would say, well, okay, I'll lose that $10,000 at that point. Rescission, this is where, again, it's the aggrieved person also has the option of rescinding the contract. So if the breach has been made concerning a material term and the aggrieved party returns everything to the way it was before the contract was made, so that's kind of like saying, let's wash our hands and walk away from this. And so you get back what you gave, and I get back what I gave, and we'll just walk away. Again, you can go into litigation mode and you can spend 1 to 2 years, doing, depositions, pre-trial conferences, having a trial, dealing with juries, or do you just want to walk away? You've got to figure out, you got to pick your battles. Not everything is, should be escalated to incredible, litigation. There are some things where it's like, fine, I'll never deal with this other party again. I just want to kind of walk away from this. So, you got to figure out what's going to be strategically the most beneficial for you. The last thing is reformation. That's where maybe the contract as originally drafted, there's something missing or there's some ambiguity to it. So, either through the court or through the parties themselves, they can, reword it. And, whether it's either, kind of like, addressing specific sections or clauses, or maybe if it's a completely redraft of the original contract, where you say, you reference the previous agreement and you say, we're setting that aside, this new agreement is what's going to dictate. You've got a lot of different options there, because again, life happens. These things do occur. Anyway, I hope this helps you kind of understand, this unique aspect of contracts in terms of remedies. So if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to call, text, or email me, and I'm always very happy to get back with you as soon as I can. But do have a good, safe, and productive rest of the week, and I'll be chatting with you all online. Thank you again so much for everything. Bye-bye.